I mean, everybody's got a story. You know, there's the stories we tell ourselves. There's the stories we invent. You know, we tell ourselves about who we are, what we stand for, where we're going.
Welcome to Ostracon, a podcast that translates fragments into the whole from which they came. So here we are in our latest installment of the Someone You Know series where we meet someone who lives a life that you may have encountered, and we get to ask questions that you may never have had the chance to ask. The questions are answered anonymously, and at the end, the guest is given an opportunity to reveal themselves. My guest today is Mr. Ghostwriter, also known as a ghost. Let me set the scene for you. We had originally planned to meet in a cemetery not far from his house, but the impending rain chased us and our equipment away. So we found ourselves on a canopy deck on a house that appears empty, but the outlets are operational. So we'll see what happens, and you may hear the locusts and the birds and some dogs in the background. Mr. Ghostwriter, tell us what you do.
Well, I guess as my name implies, I'm a ghostwriter. I write books for other people. This means that they have ideas for a book, but maybe not the time or the wherewithal to write it. So I work with them and I write it for them.
How many books have you written?
Written, I'm not sure, but I've contributed to over 130 at this point. And when I say contributed, I mean anything above an edit. So anything between a ghostwrite and an edit, which includes revisions, major revisions.
Mm-hmm. And what kinds of topics would these books fall into?
Any genre in the bookstore, basically. I've done pretty much anything you can think of, both sides of the aisle.
So, fiction, nonfiction?
Fiction, nonfiction, and really, honestly, any category.
Business?
Yeah. Religion, relationships, fantasy, sci-fi, romance,
mm-hmm.
And honestly, anything. Economics.
And we should say for our listeners that from some of the conversations you and I have had offline, you have done this quite a high profile and worked with some notable figures, but as I understand it, have also worked with some people that we would never know.
That's correct. The bulk of my clients would be people you've never heard of. But you're right. I've worked with some higher profile people. Either way, the client gets all the credit, and I am strictly a ghost.
So what's it like to work with that swath of society? And do you find the creative challenges different depending on how well known the subject is?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if it's necessarily... I mean, it probably is. Probably does have something to do with fame, but I mean, the better they're known, the bigger the ego, and the bigger the ego, the more challenging the ghostwriting relationship tends to be. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. It is harder. It's also harder knowing knowing for sure that the audience is going to be there. Everybody has that same tendency where, you start thinking about people are actually going to read this thing, and you kind of tense up about it. And so that does add a layer of challenge.
You lead me to ask a couple of questions about what you just said. What's the relationship between ego and the creative process?
Oh boy, I think it's probably a sliding scale. There's no perfect combination. But it always is a combination. You have to have a certain ego profile to want to write something that you feel people are going to want to read to begin with. And it's a special sort of profile, I think, to think that the concept that you want to put out in the world is so good that it needs to be out there even though you don't have the ability to do it yourself. So I think that the people that I encounter, it's a different kind of ego, because it's there's also the pride. There's the pride in the concept and the belief that it's valuable, but there's also a certain amount of humility that is involved with the idea of giving up that creative control or trusting someone else to manage your creative baby for you, to foster it in a way that's going to be true to your vision and well received by an audience. So I don't know if I'm necessarily the right person to ask that question, because I think I work with very interesting people on that front.
Yeah, but you also deal with more egos than most of us.
That's fair, and it is. That's why I started by saying it's a sliding scale. I mean, I've never had two clients that are alike, and that some are really easy to work with, some are not so easy to work with, but they're all in it for the same reason. They're all pursuing the same dream. They just have different ways of getting there, I guess.
What is that dream?
Publication, I suppose. Each that dream takes on different forms, because some people want to be published because they've always had this idea. Some people want to be published for strictly ego reasons. Some people want to be published because they think it'll help their business. I've worked with quite a few people who have been on the wrong side of the news cycle, that want to be published just to tell their own story, tell it the way they see it, get ahead of that cycle, or get out from under it. So, I mean, everybody publishes for the reason that they want to have their voice or their story heard. Mm-hmm. But there's any number of reasons why you might want that, I suppose.
In your experience, do you think everybody has this ego drive to be heard?
I think everyone wants to be heard. The drive, I suppose, is different. I mean, it depends on what sort of scale you want to be heard. Mm-hmm. Some people are content just to be heard at home.
What's it like to give somebody a chance to be heard?
That's why I keep doing this. I mean, I've been doing this almost 20 years now, and I work so constantly on other people's material that I've had to set aside my own dream of publishing or even writing anything. But it is really rewarding to help people realize that dream. And I've gotten lately into more of the design and publishing side as well, and being there from start to finish, being there from the conception of the idea, or the start of the process of putting that idea into words on the page, to actually holding the finished product. It's pretty incredible.
You've done this over 100 times, as you said. So it was interesting to me when you said that the existence of a larger audience has an effect on your own approach to the process, your own self-awareness. Why?
I think that's true of anyone who tries to publish. And I say that, I know it's true of anyone. Every person that I've worked with, every time, the first draft will blow through it, and it'll have problems. First drafts are always problematic in some way, so you do another draft, and you fix things. And then you get to the end of the second draft, and you start thinking about proofreading or a third draft, or you start approaching a final draft. And invariably, when you get to the end of that final draft, everybody does the same thing. They all tense up. It's as if for the first time it's occurring to them. Even after working on it for months or years, it's like it's the first time that they've realized that now someone else is going to read this. And they start thinking about what's wrong with it in a different light. There's a certain sense of, I mean, there's a vulnerability that comes from putting your work out into the world. You have to submit to that vulnerability. And I mean, truthfully, that's probably another huge part of why I'm not currently published. You know, I've been through the ringer 100+ times, and I know what it feels like. And it's an interesting line when you get there. It's an interesting line to cross.
It's interesting to me that the symbiotic relationship between you and your clients does not eliminate the vulnerability. I mean, tell me if you think I'm right with this, but it seems like the client may feel, I'm going to hire a professional, so I know it will be good, and that will give me peace of mind. But in the end, they can't escape that their name's on it.
Right.
And you have a client and are able to say to yourself, well, I'm executing their vision, but it's their vision. Mm-hmm. But still, when you come to the end, you feel it too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's no shelter, it seems.
Yeah. My guess is that you're onto something there, that working with another party to create things, it probably does lessen that that ownership. You know, if it's not well received, then at least you've got someone to blame. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's true.
You may be more attuned to that kind of relationship than your average person. So it makes me ask, do you see that relationship elsewhere in life, where people are trying to find cover in partnership? Have you found a place where it works, even if not here?
Boy, you got to submit some of these questions in advance, man. That's a thinker. I mean, your mind immediately goes to a romantic relationship, but I don't think that quite covers it. I mean, certainly business partnership is similar. Mm-hmm. If something goes wrong with the business, I mean, you're working together. 2+ minds are better than one. You're more likely to be successful if there's multiple contributors. But I suppose if things go wrong, as they often do in business, I mean, when they go wrong, partners start pointing fingers at each other. There's plenty of blame to go around. So maybe I could see that.
Here's another way to ask the question. When, if ever, in your life, do you feel deja vu? And it's like, I feel like I'm working with one of my clients here.
Huh. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I have so many clients over the years, and I tend to have multiple clients at once. So I don't know that I ever do experience that sort of deja vu, because I'm living it all the time.
Have you ever had someone else put their identity into your hands in the way that your clients do?
Not that comes to mind.
I have to believe that you're one of the few persons someone could meet that regularly deals with that amount of trust. I mean, you think maybe doctors, maybe attorneys?
Surely. Surely they could relate to that. Their responsibilities obviously carry a lot more gravity than mine do.
I think that's an interesting question, if they do or they don't.
I mean, no one's going to live or die if I don't do my job right.
Do you think that's so?
I do. I do think that's so.
Well, I mean, let's talk about that, because I want to understand, what is the fundamental thing that makes people want to tell their story? I mean, why do people come to you?
I mean, it certainly isn't a life or death matter. They come to me for a lot of different reasons. Desire to accomplish a goal. It's an itch to scratch, I think, for a lot of people. Some people do it to improve, with the idea that they're going to improve their lives in some way. Some are looking for notoriety, fame.
Yeah.
You know, I'm constantly tamping down expectations for the money side of things. You know, everybody wants to be that bestseller, which happens, but not very often.
Do you find your clients chasing ghosts?
I see what you did there. I suppose. I try to level set expectations up front, because this is a harsh business. It's a tough nut to crack. There's not a lot of money in publishing anymore. So people that come in search of fame and fortune, I try to make them understand how rare that is in this business. If they don't get that message, I don't typically work with them.
It seems to me maybe there's a couple ways that you could divide your work. And you tell me if any of these seem to resonate. Maybe you could say there's a group of people you work with who really care about the thing that they create, regardless of their success. And then there's a version of people that care about some other end, maybe completely unrelated from the work product, and are kind of strapping it on to this vehicle as a hope.
That's fair.
I mean, what's it like? Is it fair to say, to enable someone to carry these other hopes about themselves on this venture, on this that they're paying you to follow with them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason that the reaction at the finish line is always so emotional. I mean, it's a journey. It's a level of accomplishment in a very specific thing that almost no one achieves one way or another, whether it's through their own authorship or working with someone like myself. Yeah, I mean, it's a deeply emotional process, and it's a deeply emotional and rewarding achievement.
Is it hard to try and break people out of unreasonable expectations?
Some never quite get the message. Yeah, and and some hear the message and accept it early and never quite lose it. Or you never quite lose that hope that fame and fortune is at the end of this road. Accolades of some kind, but most people that come to me for the right reasons, which are, I mean, the reasons are to reach that achievement. to have a published book just for the sake of having a published book, to fulfill that dream, or to help yourself in some other way, whether you want to boost your career, or open up a world of public speaking. You're trying to raise a different boat with your book. Those people tend to understand right away.
Mm-hmm.
They know what publishing is today, or at least they can accept what publishing is today.
Mm-hmm.
But some and anyone that comes to me with a thriller, wants to be the next James Patterson.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody that comes to me with fantasy wants to write the next Harry Potter. And I shouldn't say anyone, but a lot of people that do that have these big goals, and the bringing them around is a matter of saying, how many James Pattersons are there?
Yeah.
How many J.K. Rowlings? Like, there's only one of each of them.
Have you, in your experience with these diverse clients, is there anything you've diagnosed that causes them to desire that success?
No, I've worked with all walks of life. I think there's a dreamer quality to all of them, for sure. I wish I could say that it had some sort of literary connection. Like, the people that I work with tend to be great readers, but it's not always the case. I mean, there's not really a discernible pattern other than the dream.
Here's maybe another way that you could break it down. It seems like some people come to you for craft. They know things about marketing. They know things about quality control or something. And they need somebody to convey their ideas in a clear way. Fine. But then maybe there's another group that comes to you in a much more personal identity type way, biography type work, other things that have to do with the way that they see themselves. Is that fair?
That's fair.
What's the difference between those types of jobs?
The former is they tend to approach the finished product, as a commodity, whereas the latter see it as sort of it tends to be a more, certainly emotional, almost spiritual kind of experience. I mean, getting that portion of themselves out is it's a cathartic experience.
That's what I'm so interested in, because so few people are close to that experience, and you're actually making it happen.
Yeah, I mean that it's that is in itself the reward of the job. It is genuinely an honor to help people meet that catharsis, or achieve that dream, or create a product that will be useful to them in their careers or their lives.
What do you see as being behind that catharsis?
Well, I think a certain kind of person. I mean, everybody's got a story. There's the stories we tell ourselves. There's the stories we invent, and there's some combination of those, sort of floating around in our heads at all times. Is a story that we tell ourselves about who we are, what we stand for, where we're going. And a certain kind of person just feels the need to get it down on paper. And a certain kind of person feels the need then to share that paper with as many people as they can find who will be willing to read it. I think it's a rare quality to want to do that, where everyone would do it. But I'm not sure where the line is between somebody who is content with telling themselves their own stories and the people in their orbit their own stories, and the kind of people who want to share those stories with a broader audience. I'm not sure where that line is, but it certainly is a passion. I mean, it takes form as a passion.
Do you find there's a difference between people who have a lot of relationships in their daily lives or companions, who get to see them live their day-to-day lives and affirm them or their identity or their self-image or whatever it may be, versus someone who is more isolated and maybe has less day-to-day contact with another human who reflects themselves?
The only pattern I could see there would be the clients that want to write something. The nonfiction clients tend to have their reasons for wanting to write their books, and they are purely professional, and they tend to be of the entrepreneurial stock. So they are more. They surround themselves with people. Lots of those kinds of clients will come to me saying, everybody's telling me I got to have a book. And so, they've already been talked into the process before they even reach out to me. People who write fiction do tend to be more isolated. There's exceptions to the rule, but I think that's one obvious dividing line between the kinds of people that I work with is the fiction nonfiction dividing line, and I would memoirs obviously nonfiction, but I would put that spiritually more in the fiction side of things, because it's a story that you're telling, pure story, even if it's your own story, and those people, they're more introspective, whether it's memoir or fiction. They tend to be more introspective, and sometimes they're also more introverted and more isolated. But again, that's not always the case. That certainly is a trend.
So we all do this to some degree, it seems to me. Some people take a ton of photos. Some people do it with social media. Some people have a box in their attic with all their ticket stubs and their maps and their plane tickets and whatever. Why do you think we keep all of these mementos of our own lives that we've actually lived?
Because there's a certain element. I mean, it's part of human nature. I mean, there's a certain element of your time here is brief. Your impact is likely to be short-lived.
Yeah.
So there's there's that piece of it. I mean, people want to feel like they matter and that they've made their mark, not just now, but after they're gone. And I think that appealing to that is it's funny that you bring up social media, because I've been doing this since before social media. And when I first started in this job, people had no idea. It was rare that people had even heard of ghostwriting as a possibility. Like, it was the notion that you would have someone else help you tell your story and then take credit for it. It used to just blow people's minds, and I don't I don't get that reaction as often anymore, and I think it's because we're all sort of used to outsourcing the record keeping of ourselves. I mean, social media is a great example of that. You know, we all live more publicly, or at least those of us that contribute to the social media sphere. We all live more publicly than we used to. And so the notion that, you know, you can and should have a book, even if you're not the one writing it, is not as alien as it used to be.
And so what do we do with this stuff? Like, whether it's the tickets in the box, or the memoir, or your thread from 5 years ago and when you were in a different time, a different place. What do we do with this?
Personally, or as a society?
As you observe in your special line of work.
Well, personally, I think we own it. We have it. It becomes a physical representation of ourselves outside of ourselves, which is extremely valuable for an individual, at least certain individuals, and I think most individuals.
You feel it sounds like the inevitability of death looms large in these memoirs.
Yeah, it certainly is a motivating factor. The inevitability of death is a motivating factor not just for memoirs. It's for any sort of project that I work on. I mean, there's no question that my clientele skews closer to post-retirement than pre-retirement. And that could be that could also have something to do with writing a book as a job in itself. So, you know, you don't usually have time for it. If you're a professional, you don't have time for it until you're done with your career. But I think there is a powerful motivator, and we all experience it in some way, of you get to that certain point and you start thinking about your mark on the world and being remembered.
I guess the thing that it's hard for me to imagine is after you've done that process, you generate a product. The product is necessarily incomplete. It's going to be a version of your life. It can't be everything, and it can only be from the available perspectives. But you generate this product and you hold it up and you say, now, this is me. And I wonder if you can make like a fetish of an incomplete version of yourself.
It's possible. I mean, I do think that memoir tends to focus on a specific element of a person. You know, there's a tendency to view through a narrow lens on the part of the client and on the part of the ghost, and frankly on the part of the audience. I mean, memoir. I mean, that's what separates memoir from biography. It's a snapshot. I mean, if you want a full picture of a person's life, you kind of have to wait until they're dead, and then you're getting it from a third party. So, I mean, I suppose the bigger question. Maybe I am or am not answering it, but the bigger question is it possible, really, to fully know a person?
Yeah.
Even one that attempts to tell you who they are in a book.
Yeah. What do you think?
I don't know. I like to think the effort's worth it.
Has anyone ever shared with you anything really difficult? Like extreme suffering, struggles that they've lived through that they want to record?
Yeah. I don't want to.
I know you
It's
can't
ju-
share the content.
Yeah,
but
it's challenging to give too many details, but I've worked with survivors of really horrific child abuse. I've worked with survivors of genocide. Um, it's, the Yes, there are some truly harrowing stories that I've been asked to help foster to the finish line, and there's a certain amount of self-preservation that has to happen doing this work. You've got to try to forget the things you work on. First of all, I don't think it's possible to hold all that story in your head without going crazy. But the other factor is some of those stories you don't want to hold on to, and those are of course the hardest ones to let go. But yes, I have helped people do that, and across the board, it has been a relief to them. It has been therapeutic to get that down. It's almost like it. I think there's an element of trauma that part of this suffering is that you don't. If it's really horrific, I think you have a hard time, even if you lived it, believing that it happened. And there's a certain element that comes from putting it down on the page, even though you know you did it, that you made it happen, you made it get onto the page. Actually seeing it there makes it real, and making it real is a huge part of overcoming it. I'm not saying ghostwriting's the best therapy, or my clients that went through all this terrible stuff were that much better for it in the end, but it certainly helps. I do often feel like a therapist.
What is it like to carry all these stories? I mean, do you feel like they cloud around you? Do you feel like you're speaking with 1,000 voices?
No, and that kind of gets back to what I was saying. I forget these things, intentionally or unintentionally. I have to. I mean, I can't carry everything. I mean, I carry a piece of everything that I've worked on. I know a little bit about a lot of things and a lot of people, and I've lived a small portion of a lot of different lives. But I don't think that, I don't retain it completely. At least not. It's not conscious enough, this retention, that I feel like I've got multiple people in here, or more experiences than most. I think I've been exposed to the intimacies of quite a few different lives, but I haven't absorbed them as my own, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. The catharsis that you talk about, does that have anything to do with us finding our own identity in narrative? Is that how we identify ourselves?
Well, I think that speaks to what we've been talking about. Just like putting the trauma on the page makes the trauma real, putting the story on the page makes the story real. And if it's a story about yourself, then it's confirmation in some ways of the story you've been telling yourself, the story you think other people have been telling about you. It writes stories that you feel are wrong. I do think that's a part of it. I think it's, I don't want to use a birth analogy, but there is an element of, it's like having a child in some ways. You can see yourself in it, in it's a physical manifestation of a portion of yourself, and you can see it and you can hold it, and I think it's a similar kind of, it's not nearly as rewarding but as having a child, but it's a similar kind of feeling, I think.
What about your own narrative? Does your self-narrative involve the way that you give voice to others?
I'm sure it does. I mean, there's no way to, you know, you're writing about someone else's life. There's no way for them to translate every single detail to you from memory. There's going to be fog there. Some things are going to be lost to time. And when that happens, I've got to fictionalize certain things or guess, do a lot of educated guesswork. And in those scenarios, I mean, certainly I'm seeing it through my own lens. So there's going to be a bias there. There's going to be a portion of myself that goes into anything. There's going to be a portion of my voice that I can't possibly shake.
We talked about people's histories necessarily being limited in scope and perspective. You talked about this other element about the portions of your own voice that are impossible to completely extricate. Is there ever a danger that something about the person's actual identity is changed when it's formalized?
Meaning, do you think, is the question, am I working with the authentic person, or am I working with the version of that person wants the world to see?
Yeah.
I'm sure I've worked with both. It's really easy to tell the difference between the people who are truer to themselves and the people that have a specific motive for publishing. But I mean, that goes back to the question of, do we ever even personally know if we're telling an accurate story about ourselves?
It's a great question.
I have no idea. I mean, I've written a lot of stories, and I don't know the answer to that.
And so your experience of writing all of this with all of these people hasn't been enough to clarify that.
I think I've been exposed to a lot of evidence that the drive is there to do it. But I don't know that there's any way to prove one way or another whether there is such a thing as an objective truth about oneself.
About a narrative.
Yeah.
You said it's easy to tell the difference between the people who are presenting themselves in a chosen light, mm-hmm. versus just an open book on all fronts. Mm-hmm. Why is it so easy to tell?
Consistency of story. You know, you also you kind of get I don't know, maybe this is just the byproduct of my job, but reading people becomes easier the longer you write about them. I don't know. I guess I've seen it in action. So how do I define it? Some people are trying to share themselves, and some people are trying to sell themselves. And the difference is usually pretty obvious.
You mentioned consistency, and I'd like to focus on that for a second. Is the tendency towards consistency, does that fall into the category of the people that are selling themselves because the story is already boxed up?
Right. Well, that's a good question. I think that there's a certain, so a person that has a story neatly boxed up probably has told it to themselves enough. I mean, they've obviously told it to themselves enough times that it sounds the same every time
Mm-hmm.
when they say it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got to accept that there's probably been some myth making that happened there.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably some untruths sprinkled in to connect the dots, and it's especially obvious if the carefully rehearsed story has holes in it. I mean, it's just like it's like a cop drama, right? Like the interrogation room techniques work for a reason. You sit two different suspects down in two different rooms and you have them tell the same story and see if they're consistent. See how rehearsed they sound.
Mm-hmm.
If they're rehearsed, they're probably not true. But, at the same time, there's also inconsistencies can also mean the opposite. I mean, it's if somebody is making up a story on the fly, you can also pick up on that.
Yeah.
I think that somebody who's being genuinely honest with themselves and about their story can tell it. Doesn't always sound exactly the same, but when confronted with inconsistencies, they accept it. Oh yeah, that's probably not accurate. Let me think about that. Why? How did that really go?
Mm-hmm.
Being a willingness to be flawed and a willingness to accept some gray area in the story, I think is a more honest approach. It is a more honest take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you point out a willingness to be flawed. I mean, I wonder if the rehearsed self-narrative
Sure.
is tied up with a self-justification.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if somebody has an answer for everything, I mean, that tends to come from maybe a lack of security in the... No, I don't know if that's true.
What if you put down somebody's story, and this could be a biography, memoir, could be fiction, and maybe even you did it exactly how they asked you to, but when you actually see the content, it's not at all what they visualized. Does that happen?
Not usually by the end. Early drafts, there tends to be some give and take on expectation. I always want to write things that are as true as possible. But it's a process to get the details right.
Yeah, and maybe I should be more clear, because I'm less concerned about the craft of polishing the product and making it accurate. I'm more interested in the revelatory aspect of it, where someone gives their story to you, and then when their story is told back to them in a new written medium, it's almost as though they're hearing it for the first time.
Yeah, there's a certain element of that, definitely. Sometimes they're surprised at how compelling their story can sound. Sometimes they're surprised by how much the storytelling sounds exactly like them. More often than not, people get the work back and they're like, I feel like I wrote this. So that's cool. But yeah, I mean, to the deeper question about, does it open their eyes to something new about themselves? I mean, that does happen. It does happen.
You talked about inconsistencies earlier. I mean, have you ever found yourself in a situation where you start asking questions? Well, wait a minute, I thought it was this way, or I thought it was that way, and you explode some theory that someone has been living with, and they just have never subjected to analysis.
Sure. Yeah, that happens often.
I mean, what's that moment like?
They usually. I mean, it blows them away. I mean, they're usually pretty distracted for the rest of the meeting. But it often will be that the mind is blown in the moment, and then they'll go back and they'll rethink things, and they'll come back with a different understanding. And sometimes they come back with a different story to explain why their original understanding was correct. It just depends on the person, but it does happen.
Do they fight it?
I mean, not initially. No, they don't usually. No, they don't fight it initially. But the fight, if there is a fight, would take the form of coming back with a different version of the story that confirms the original understanding. And I don't know if that's necessarily even. I mean, it certainly doesn't qualify as a fight in terms of creative control or just a fight with themselves about how they understand themselves. You know what I mean? Yeah.
So I've read about something called cognitive dissonance, which, if I've got this wrong, somebody can put it in the comments, but the example I always heard was somebody would like an apple, they see it on the tree, it's too high to reach, and they say, actually, I didn't want an apple anyway. That was something else going on that I mistook as a desire for an apple. But they might not have understood themselves that way if the apple was in reach. They might say, this was just what I wanted. And I guess you could ask the deeper question is whether or not they ever really wanted an apple at all, and whether their experience of getting it shapes what they thought they wanted, or if their wants are authentic, but they have to package them up some way that they don't conflict with their experience of real life. This sounds maybe like what you're living with sometimes.
It's a fair assessment, sure. Yeah.
Do you find more people can or cannot reach the apple?
The apple in the in this analogy, is it truth? Is it the end product? What's the apple?
Let's say it's the story they wish to tell themselves.
Story they wish to tell themselves. I think more people reach that apple than not. Sometimes their understanding of the apple changes over the course of the process, but I mean that's the nature of memoir. That's the nature of storytelling in general.
So now let's say the apple is truth, whether it's a fictional story that conveys truth, or a memoir or a biography that paints an accurate picture of the self. How many people get that apple?
I think it's impossible to answer. I mean that's what we've been getting at for a while here. I think if the goal is to be satisfied with the version of the truth that winds up on the page, then I think everyone gets there. But I mean, you're right. I mean, there's influences along the way. There's my own influence. There's the influence of a person's understanding of themselves, and that tends to evolve over time. Certainly, the more introspection and the more interview that happens during the process, the more the narrative changes, the more the truth changes. But we try.
I have 3 questions I want to go back that we started earlier, and I'd like to ask in light of the material we've covered. You talked about how somebody having a stronger ego can make it harder to get to a finished product. Is that because of the interaction between their ego and this process of drawing out a story that is internally consistent and believable?
I think that's probably true. I mean, it's part of the definition of what the ego is, right? I mean, it is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and the stronger the ego, the more firmly rooted and generally detailed that story tends to be.
We talked about the fear that people have when they get to the final version and realize it's going to be out in the world. But we talked about this intense desire to cathartically or otherwise put down this image of the self that is outside the self. It seems like that should alleviate the fear, or maybe it could, but it doesn't.
Only if you fully believe the story you're telling yourself about yourself, then sure. But if you feel like, everybody has their insecurities about that story, and so sharing it with the world exposes those insecurities.
So maybe the issue is we're all a little uncertain about who we think we are.
Sure.
Again, dealing with that image of the self outside the self. Has anyone ever actually said to you something along the lines of, when I'm losing consciousness, I'll have the peace that this is out there somewhere?
Losing consciousness.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody's ever said that directly, but that sentiment is a part of it. I mean, that desire to feel as if there's a part of you that will survive is a part of this.
Is there anything else other than a written narrative or some other recorded narrative, whatever medium you want to use? Is there something else that has the potential to create that image of the self outside the self?
I think that's what art is. Any form of art. It's true of any form of art.
Mm-hmm.
From sculpture to music to architecture, like any attempt for a person to leave their personal mark in the physical world,
Mm-hmm.
or the intellectual one, collective, social one. It's all the same.
What about the fact that we all share the same desire, it seems, from your experience, but we're not all artists?
I mean, I guess the drive is different for different people. Lots of people are content to lead the lives that they lead, and don't have that drive or desire to leave a mark. Content with the influence they've had on people in their lives or their own space. Some people just want to make a bigger impact.
Which side of the line do you think you fall on?
I'm 41 and I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I've been doing this half my life. I don't know.
So I think of whatever it was, Voyager or some satellite that they sent out through the solar system. And somebody put the golden record on it, where it was music and other data, math, other things humanity has discovered. I think there was encyclopedic data, pictures, something to say, hey, in case you find this, there's an advanced society that knows and does all these other things beyond what is evident from this technology. I think of that because I think of all these stories and you writing these stories, and I wonder, number one, does all of it deserve to be written? Does all this experience, should it all go in the bank in some way? And number two, as a culture, what do we do with it?
Well, with the first one, you're asking me to get into something pretty subjective, and I can only give the answer from my own narrow scope.
Mm-hmm.
I don't work with everybody who inquires with me, so the answer to does it all deserve to be written is no. What do we do with it? I mean, there's so very much information now. I'm not sure it's possible to contain it all, even now.
Mm-hmm.
and it only expands. So I don't know that I know the answer to that either. I know that it's a worthwhile endeavor to capture your story if it's worth telling.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that it's worthwhile even if it doesn't find a broad audience or become a classic or be cherished forever. But and I also think it's that element, that the storytelling and the remembrance and the preservation of these ideas is part of the human condition. So the pursuit is always worth it.
And would you say that even if the story were never read?
Would I say the same thing if the story were never read?
Yeah.
From the perspective of humanity, and thinking of the satellite launched into forever, containing all these details about humanity, that was certainly a worthy endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
The overwhelming odds are that it will never be found.
Mm-hmm.
But firing it out there was worthwhile. And I think that's true of every individual story. That's worth telling anyway.
So, Mr. Ghostwriter, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
And do you care to reveal to us who you are?
I think for the sake of my clients, I'll stay anonymous. That's all right with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.